hosted by the Watson Institute's Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies. My name is Alexandria Nylen, and I'm a research associate in the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies program in Civil Military Affairs. And I'm so excited to moderate this evening's discussion. After introducing our two panelists, Chiara, Romano, Bosch, and Amany Qaddour, each will speak for around 10 minutes on their experiences in Ukraine and Syria. And then I will ask them a series of questions in order to tease out the similarities and differences between these two responses with the hopes of learning something broader about humanitarianism in the 21st century. And then for the last 20 minutes, I will open up the floor for audience questions. And following that conversation, we can all enjoy catered reception in the lobby. So we are all certainly in for a treat tonight. Our two excellent discussants bring with them over 20 combined years of experience in the humanitarian sector. So Amany Qaddour is a visiting scholar at the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies. She serves as the regional director of Syria Relief and Development, or SRD, which is a nonprofit organization operating on the ground in Syria since 2011. She is currently an associate faculty member and a doctor of public health candidate at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She holds a bachelor's degree in human biology and psychology and a master's degree in health services administration, both from the University of Kansas. And Chiara Romano Bosch is a visiting scholar from the United Nations World Food Program. And she is staying with us at the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies. Chiara is currently working for WFP in Rome at their headquarters. And she works as a humanitarian military interaction officer. Chiara has served at WFP for 7 years, and before her current post, she covered a number of diverse roles within the organization. Most recently, Chiara has been deployed to Ukraine, working between the political level and the contact lines. So, like I mentioned before, first we'll start out with Chiara giving us a bit of background.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, of course.
Hi, everyone. We're hoping this will be more of a discussion with everyone, so hopefully everyone's has lots of questions, and please feel free to interrupt me as I go along. But yeah, as Alex mentioned, I've been working for the UN World Food Program for about 7 years. It's one of the UN humanitarian agencies, and I was deployed to Ukraine in March this year, where I stayed for about 3 months. I'm sure everyone has a lot of information about this and already knows, but just to give a slight overview on the Ukraine context, end of February this year, the conflict that is known as the Ukraine-Russia conflict commenced with a very sudden escalation of hostilities, which triggered a massive displacement of refugees and internally displaced people from Ukraine, mostly towards Europe. And that, because of the escalation and the hostilities throughout the country, most people in the country ended up needing shelter assistance, food assistance, had wash needs. And we're also talking about a time in the year where in Ukraine it's very, very cold. So assisting people at that time was extremely complicated. People had a lot of needs, and the needs were worse also due to the temperatures. I think the big concerns at the time were the loss of life, the civilian casualties. The conflict in Ukraine has been another conflict which has shown that the targets have not just been the soldiers or the people fighting, but really just the civilian population. So a lot of people left. I think by the time I was there in March, April, 1 out of every 4 Ukrainians was either an internally displaced person, which means they had stayed in the country but they had moved to a safer area, or they were refugees and they had gone to Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, Italy as far as they could go, Poland mostly. So there was mass movement, huge loss of life, and just really high needs for shelter, for food and wash. At the same time, Ukraine is a country that has a very innovative economy. It's considered a middle-income country. For an agency like the World Food Program, where we look at food insecurity and food needs, it was hard to understand what the food needs were, right? Because it's not a country where people were necessarily on the brink of famine. It's just a country where people needed food like any of us would need food. So we had multiple problems as WFP, lots of them, starting with the fact that usually when I'm deployed to an operation, I go somewhere where we most of the time have an office. We're present in about 84, 85 countries. We were not present in Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine is a country where we bought food for some of our other operations. So we bought wheat and grain and oil and other commodities from Ukraine to serve our operations in Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, like Eastern Africa. There were lots of operations that benefited from things that came out of Ukraine. And instead, all of a sudden, we had to serve Ukraine. That was different for us. I think it was particularly different for our Ukrainian colleagues that joined us and came to serve their country. And that was something that we had to start from scratch. We just weren't present in Ukraine. So when we opened the Ukraine operation, well, initially we were actually deployed to Poland because we couldn't go inside Ukraine. So when we opened Poland, Ukraine, we opened Hungary, Slovakia, Moldova, Romania, and Russian Federation because we are a humanitarian agency. That means that we have to be neutral, we have to be impartial, we have to respect principles, and ultimately we need to talk to both sides. So we can't just talk to the Ukrainian side, we also have to talk to the Russian side. So we opened lots of offices at the same time. We needed to see what the needs were in Ukraine, but we also needed to see what the needs were in the other countries. Like, was there a need for WFP assistance in Hungary, in Slovakia, and Romania? If there wasn't, we would leave. And we did close some of those offices. Some of them remain open, and some of them we just shortly phased out. So I guess the first questions that we had to look into for WFP was find out, what do people need and how do we serve them? But how do you do that when everybody is moving? So you had a very mobile community of people leaving. So our priority was, okay, we will focus on the people who are still in Ukraine and see what assistance that they need. And we had two different types of food access problems. We had a group of people that were stuck in what were considered besieged areas. We didn't have access to them, and they didn't have access to food, or it was considered that they didn't have access to food. And then there were people who could have access to food. They had moved to places where there were food, but they had no money to pay for food. So we had to figure out, okay, are we going to give them in-kind food, which for us is literally, tuna given to a person, or can we potentially give cash to people so that they can buy their own food and they can choose what they're buying? So we ended up splitting the program. We did an in-kind and a cash response, and we kind of hoped that the cash response would help stabilize the economy or support the economy a little bit. So that's kind of what the beginning of the operation started to look like. But being in Poland and Ukraine those first days, I can tell you that our program was changing by the day. Every day we were like, okay, the needs are going to be here, and then the next day something else would happen and the needs would change somewhere else. It's a very volatile context. At one point it looked like it was stabilizing, and in May, June, throughout the summer, there was a little bit of hope. People started to come back to Ukraine. People started to want to go home and check in on their homes. But in the last couple of weeks, the escalation of violence has created more refugees and more IDPs because people have left again. Not to mention that it's winter. The winter is harsh in Ukraine, so people are leaving. But the reality is that they've lost their jobs, or they've lost their assets, or they've lost their house. So we continue to provide a mix of in-kind and cash assistance to Ukrainians. And our biggest office outside of Ukraine is actually Moldova, which is still receiving a really big influx, and the other countries are being supported by their own governments. I think I'll kind of wrap it up on what was challenging and what was different for us in this response. I think working in a context like Ukraine was interesting for me personally, but I think for WFP because we set up a new operation from scratch, but as we were setting it up, we were already thinking, how do we make sure that we leave? Like, we can't stay in Ukraine forever. We shouldn't stay in Ukraine forever. So we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know how the hostilities are going to go. But if it remains somewhat stable, could we leave? And if we leave, what do we need to make sure that we leave? Because we don't need to justify our existence. We already have other operations that we need to serve. We have a lot of work to do. We don't need to stay in Ukraine long term. So we made sure that we established partnerships with local actors and civil society and the government to make sure that whatever system we set up would be sustainable and that we had an exit strategy. And I think that link between the emergency and the development side was kind of interesting and kind of what we would hope to do more of in the future. So, yeah. I think I'm going to leave the overview to this, but happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you. Yep.
Oh,
Yep.
shall I?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Amany.
Thanks, Chiara. Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue and sort of contradiction to what Syria has been, which is a very short-sighted humanitarian response. And I think kind of now being in its 11th year is exactly that. There has been no exit strategy, no sort of transition plan, simply because the crisis has had its ebbs and flows. There have been constant relapses into fragility. There's been an escalation of violence sort of repeatedly over many years. And I think that's, as a humanitarian and a public health practitioner, is really really frustrating in terms of reactive measures rather than proactive measures in terms of humanitarian response. And I want to, for those who haven't followed Syria as closely in the last decade or so, I just want to emphasize maybe a few distinct inflection points over the years and really look at it more from a human rights violations perspective, specifically in terms of Syria, and certainly some parallels in terms of mass displacements of the population due to repeated attacks to civilian infrastructure, where now, at this point now in 2022, you have over half of the pre-war population essentially displaced either inside the country, outside of the country, certainly many either killed, detained, disappeared, or just, as I said, displaced in neighboring countries. I think one thing to emphasize is there's been sort of a documented series of, as I said, attacks to civilian infrastructure. Chemical weapons has been a particular element in Syria that I think oftentimes it's referred to as a red line. Specifically with Syria, we saw that many times, but it repeatedly carried out on civilian members of the civilian population. Sieges to these same populations. Closely linked to sieges, obviously, is the ability, and closely linked to WFP, is the ability to actually get food in for populations, and from a health perspective, getting medical care. And this is really one element that's led to tremendous food insecurity across the country and malnutrition. More recently, we really faced that as a challenge as sort of an indirect byproduct of what was happening in Ukraine. For example, the population that we serve from northwest Syria, which neighbors Turkey, relies on massive wheat imports from Turkey. So Turkey has, I think, over 80% of its wheat imports actually serve the population of northwest Syria. So just thinking about in terms of this massive disruption of supply chain related to a crisis that is happening quite far away. Oftentimes people do try to create some of these parallels or sort of dismiss one crisis versus another. And I think what's important is there is sort of this invisible linkage between all of these crises and a lot of lessons learned, particularly for someone who's been operating in Syria, is just really understanding the intricate linkages between food insecurity, malnutrition, economic deterioration. This is something that we're seeing now across the region, not only within Syria, but within its neighbors as well. Lebanon is having a massive
rate of food insecurity, economic deterioration, devaluation of the Lebanese pound, and the same for Turkey as well. And this is all obviously impacting Syria as well, simply because we know the regional dynamics in those countries. And then just in terms of thinking of health outcomes and how these are affected and closely linked to malnutrition and food insecurity, I think for us this has been one of the most difficult aspects when you think about sort of the collapse or fragmentation of health infrastructure in the country. And as I said before, repeated attacks to civilian infrastructure. The most salient has been attacks to health facilities, schools, marketplaces, and other forms of civilian infrastructure. And I think for us, this is what's been difficult, is really adequately responding to some of these health needs. At the same time, there are these very pronounced and distinct systematic targeting of civilian infrastructure and obviously aid workers themselves. I know some sort of actually work on aid worker security, and this is a particular element that we've actually tried to focus on as Syria Relief and Development and our work on the ground in Syria. And Chiara mentioned innovation. I think innovation to protect aid workers has been one of the most challenging aspects for us, because after 10 years, when there have been repeated attacks, there's only so much you can do to fortify hospitals, to have 5-6 stories underground, have entire operating theaters, to protect not only your staff but also patients. And we've had entire health facilities destroyed on camera, open source, information. Very, very public, notorious cases in Syria. It has not been a secret, sort of the level of destruction behind attacks to these health facilities. And I just, in terms of thinking sort of from, if we're looking at a decade of 2011 to 2015, more government of Syria, for example, carrying out these aerial attacks to health facilities. But following 2015, you had sort of the introduction of more international non-state actors supporting the government of Syria and actually helping carry out some of these crimes. And that was, I would say, this is really morbid to say, but sort of the game changer in terms of attacks to civilian infrastructure is just that support at a time when the government of Syria was feeling quite fatigued in terms of resources, and having Russia in particular coming in to support with aerial attacks to health infrastructure, I think has been one of the most destructive aspects of the crisis for us. And with every wave of attacks, there are mass displacements. There's more and more people living in displacement camps, or IDP camps, as Chiara referred to them, and really just trying to rapidly mobilize and respond to the needs of these populations. And I think I just want to wrap up and sort of center it around some of the more recent sort of public health crises in Syria and obviously globally, which is one is COVID. So for us with our COVID response, it was extremely challenging when we had such weakened health infrastructure, and oftentimes it not being prioritized by the population when you have food insecurity, people living on less than $1 a day, an inability to even find a job, children out of school, a rise in child recruitment to non-state armed groups, just all of these, this melting pot, this culmination of factors with very dangerous outcomes. And closely linked to that, and more recently, is cholera outbreaks that have been happening in Syria due to contamination in water across the country. But the reason why cholera has been particularly challenging is one, although nearby countries, often, Yemen, for example, massive cholera outbreaks over the years. Cholera is quite new in Syria, and the population, including health responders, are sort of still navigating how to adequately respond to this because it's so unfamiliar. But as a humanitarian working on the health side, that's just one piece of the puzzle. And this is what I meant to tie it back to the short-sightedness of the sector. When we think about water and sanitation, that's one of the core sort of elements of contamination, of spread, of cholera, but also a prevention aspect. And for us working on the health side, we've been able to deliver healthcare services. But when you think of water and sanitation, oftentimes the infrastructure related to that and the long-term investment is more a development mandate, which is really where we found sort of this silo in response and now actually struggling because there's only so much you can do from a health perspective if you're not treating sort of the root causes and the issue underlying this outbreak. So I want to stop there because I know we might have some questions and would definitely like this to be a little bit more dynamic. But that's Syria, 10 minutes, 10 years, 10 plus years, yeah.
Thank you so much to both of you. You both bring such a wealth of experience and knowledge to us tonight. And I have so many questions for you, but I'll be sure not to take up the whole time. I won't be selfish. So my first question, we can already see, like, kind of pick out some of the differences in the responses, but I thought it would be useful if I could just ask you what stands out to both of you in terms of the key differences between these two humanitarian responses, and you can answer in whatever order you'd like. We don't have any structure. And then the next step of that question is if you could maybe hypothesize on the spot what these differences might tell us about contemporary humanitarianism.
Okay, I guess I'll go first.
Thanks, Chiara.
This is on. Okay, I think for us a big difference was definitely the scale and the speed. I think we reached numbers in Ukraine that I think took about 10 years for Syria, maybe, in terms of refugee and IDP numbers. We didn't see that, and in Ukraine it was very, very fast. So even for WFP, I think we reached about 1 million people with food assistance in about a month and a half. The numbers that we were being asked to serve in such a short amount of time were probably unlike anything that we've ever had to do. And then I will also say that for WFP, Syria was a cross-line operation. We were able to kind of access everybody, almost. I would say almost everybody, and we could move between countries. And in the Ukraine context, we could not. It was not a cross-line operation. It was only assistance within Ukraine, and we did not have access to do cross-border from the other side. So it was, I think those are the two main differences for me. I don't know about you.
I think I have 7, but I'm not sure. I mean, just in terms of thinking, I mean, Chiara did mention, this middle income sort of element. And I think with Syria, I will start with sort of some similarities, because I think that is important, where although Syria, there were proxy wars, this was following the Arab Spring where other countries had also experienced conflict. I think, Syria just being a middle income country where you do have a well-educated population, a very robust, health, just speaking of health, a medical education system, for example. But then thinking in terms of there had never been a humanitarian response there. Certainly they had welcomed Iraqi refugees, but there just wasn't this well-oiled machine. It wasn't an institutionalized response. And I think that's one of the elements, seeing how rapidly things were mobilized in Ukraine is really, in Syria, sort of this lag. And because of access issues, is local actors being the ones at the forefront. I think that's a distinguishing factor with Syria. And for those who are familiar with the localization agenda, in terms of just local actors being at the forefront was really important. I will say just the protracted crisis element has come with its challenges, just the absolute fatigue of humanitarian responders, the dwindling of funding relative to so many other crises in the world that are just as imperative, and certainly the desensitization of people, even asking, is that still happening? Oh, I thought the war was over, with many other contexts as well. And then I will just say the element of just it being a non-international armed conflict, which as it ties to international humanitarian law and human rights law, just really navigating sort of the accountability space quite differently, where Syria has now, unfortunately, set a precedent for how far violations can go, because there are limitations in the technicalities around who is held accountable in this. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Did you want me to add on similar? Okay.
Please jump in.
I guess a couple. I will agree that it was similar in Ukraine in terms of the emergency and development context, because like I said, Ukraine was a country where we bought food from and didn't see ourselves kind of giving food in. So there was definitely a shift for a really big country, which is, I guess here it's relative because it's about the size of Texas, but for us suddenly have to serve a country or have to, cover a country that could potentially be the size of Texas was very daunting and a lot to cover. But there was a sudden need to have to shift to emergency response and emergency gear. And Ukraine has, I think, like Syria, like a lot of very strong local actors and a very responsive civil society. But there was like a shift in mentality. All of a sudden, everybody was in emergency mode, and that was unexpected. I will also say that perhaps the air threat, like the biggest risk for us, at least in Ukraine, was the air threat, and that kept things very dynamic, very volatile. We didn't know how things were going to go. And I guess the coverage and where people needed most assistance, because I feel like, and this for me is perhaps a difference, whereas in Syria it was multiple people in different places in different pockets. For Ukraine, at one point when things stabilized a little more, it was very specific to a certain area, and the rest of the country was quite normal. I could be in one part of Ukraine drinking a matcha latte, and then the front line was a completely different reality. So you had, very high needs with people who needed a lot of assistance, and then you had really big chunks of the country that seemed almost normal if it wasn't for the airstrike risk. So you had this quasi-fake normality, and I think that was very distinct for us because the types of assistance that we had to give in the country were very different, and I think in Syria it was definitely a lot more spread out.
Right. Amany, I see you writing. Did you want to add something, or is that
No,
notes
just,
for later?
well, I mean, yeah, she just reminded me because, like sort of these pockets of stability versus fragility. I think for us, that's what we really do struggle with now in Syria, where there is more this post-conflict narrative emerging.
Right.
Almost as a tactic, sort of to emphasize that, the war is over, it's time to invest in reconstruction, it's time to invest in development, and that doesn't come without any, hidden incentives, I think, and so that's sort of what it reminded me of. And then just in terms of, identifying where there are these pockets of stability, instability, it is so dynamic, and being able to respond to that in real time, where oftentimes, I would say, and maybe Chiara can relate, is just this oversaturation of services in certain pockets, maybe due to access as well in Syria, which is what we saw. If you look at these, maps of services, oftentimes there is a saturation for certain populations, and then hard to reach populations simply being neglected because of that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for giving more detail to that. In your opinion, what were some of the key lessons that you learned from participating in your given response? And do you think that these lessons could possibly be generalized to other responses? And if not, why? If so, maybe how?
You want to go first this time?
Okay.
You can also take
that's
a
fine.
sip of water.
Okay.
I'll just go. I mean, for us, it's been, in terms of lessons, there are so many lessons learned. I think I did mention local actors, which is really a point of passion for me in terms of that sort of setting the precedent for other responses, is really mobilizing people who are on the ground first rather than bringing in, international actors. I think oftentimes that is disruptive. When we're talking about natural disaster, that's a bit different because oftentimes those communities are the ones affected. But when you think about sort of these long-term protracted crises, is some of the unintended consequences, even just in terms of the economy, is actually displacing local actors because of that, and some of the inequalities and inequities that exist between international and local responders. And then I would just think in terms of lessons is very distinct programs or services that we've delivered that have been quite novel or innovative in Syria, and now sort of have set an example for others. For us, one certainly is actually protecting health facilities, and there's only so much you can do when you're dealing with such sophisticated weaponry and smart missiles, but certainly is just more creative means to protect some of these forms of civilian infrastructure. And then just in terms of us, is really the protection elements. A lot of these novel approaches that have emerged from Syria, for one, as our work in Syria has been a distinct program for women and girls. I mentioned a lot related to economic deterioration, limitations in livelihood and job opportunities. For us, this had indirect consequences in terms of child marriage. So young adolescent girls actually being forced into child marriages, or oftentimes families not having other coping mechanisms. And for us, we actually developed certain distinct programs called, one of them is the Young Mothers Club, which we developed with UNFPA, which is the UN arm for sexual and reproductive health and family planning, and Care International, for those of you who have heard of that NGO, just in terms of really developing a tailored program for young adolescents and focusing on sexual reproductive health for this vulnerable group that actually was not necessarily apparent at the start of the crisis, but really that emerging vulnerability over 10 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess going from that, I think I'm also going to touch on, and I don't know if they're lessons because, but maybe like key takeaways. But I think Ukraine, despite the very dire context, gave us a lot of possibility to kind of think outside of the box and be creative with the solutions that we wanted, because we were operating in a country where everybody had a cell phone and where cell phone service was pretty good, and where the government already had a social safety net program, and all we could do is like think about, instead of us setting up a social safety net program, we could just piggyback on what the government had, and we could augment it, and we could do it together. So I think working alongside the local actors was really good, but we also had the luxury of being in a context where those systems already existed, so we could just augment it. And the same thing goes for the partnerships that we had. We managed to have a really good partnership with essentially what is like the UPS of Ukraine. It's called Nova Poshta, and it's also tied to a banking system, and we managed to do different types of programs with them. And again, we had the luxury of a system already existing, and just be kind of very innovative. I mean, we were in a country where we had Uber Eats. So at one point we established a partnership with Uber Eats. That is not something that we are going to be able to do in a lot of our operations, unfortunately, because this doesn't exist in the majority of WFP operations. But I would like to think that should we find ourselves in another similar context, and hopefully not, that we would kind of keep that kind of innovation and that thinking outside of the box and working with what we find and not duplicating. And I think that's something that worked really well. And I guess also what I mentioned earlier about having an exit plan in mind as soon as we went there. Ukraine is the third country that I've deployed to where we started something from zero. So it was interesting to see in this one that we, from the first very early days, we were already thinking, okay, whatever we establish, we need to be able to leave it to the local actors, or whatever we establish, we need to be able to phase it out in a way that doesn't do any harm. And I hope that that's something that we keep in mind for other contexts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So sounds like a lot of really interesting and important innovations and adaptations from both contexts. Thank you for detailing those a little bit more. So now slightly changing tack. So we know about the heavily complicated role that Russia played in the Syrian crisis and, of course, Ukraine. We can think about the cascading food crises, for example. How does Ukraine affect the situation in Syria from a humanitarian perspective, and perhaps vice versa?
This one's all yours.
I mean, I did try to touch on this a little bit earlier. I think one of the most pronounced effects was related to the food security at a time when economic deterioration has been on the rise in the last year or so, I would say, year or two. But certainly more of an indirect consequence, I think, is back to this desensitization concept, really, is where, so many other crises and contexts right now, Ukraine being one of them as well, is really just, I would say, just to be very realistic in terms of oftentimes loss of capacity. So for Syria, You're dealing with a lot of humanitarian aid actors, including from the international community, that mobilized and left to Ukraine. That was an immediate direct consequence. We saw like an influx of senior level people who had a wealth of experience. So that was one, loss of capacity. And two, obviously, the funding landscape. And I think that's a reality with any humanitarian response. And that's where I think the humanitarian sector is really having an existential moment and crisis, is really, no pun intended, but really just to think of how do we work towards sustainability? How do we think from the beginning, what is the exit plan? What is the transition plan or the strategy? And oftentimes I think, with Syria, that's what's been difficult is not anticipating a lot of these elements that are going to come later on. Certainly are other crises emerging. Now, they may be indirectly linked, but for us, I think that's been one of the most visible as well. Right. And I think you had another question, but I can't remember it now. So I'll just give Chiara.
Well, I think, I think for WFP, it's had a trickle. I mean, I guess here we're dealing with like a trickle-down effect throughout WFP operations because Ukraine is such a big kind of ally in terms of exports and things that we used to buy from Ukraine, but also the loss of the wheat, the grain, and the oil, and quite frankly also the fertilizer that used to come out of Russia. All of those things combined have ended up causing massive problems throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa, and is also going to impacting inflation throughout Europe, right? Because all of those commodities which used to come out of Ukraine can no longer come out of Ukraine because there's also a logistical problem. Most of it used to come by sea. There's now an initiative that has established that some of it can still be exported by sea, but not all of it will end up leaving the country. And then what people also don't realize is if those commodities used to be exported in massive quantities and you all of a sudden have 20 million tons of mixed commodities stuck in Ukraine, and you manage to take 5 out, you still have 15 million metric tons that are stuck in silos. So where are you going to put this year's harvest? You don't have anywhere to put this year's harvest. Or maybe you can build it. But chances are you're going to lose on both sides. You're going to lose part of the new harvest, and you're going to lose part of the old one. That means that financially, the repercussions of this on the Ukrainian economy and on Ukrainians who used to live from this, we're going to see those effects in the coming months and the coming years. And then we're going to see the trickle-down effect in Europe and Middle East and Northern Africa. So I think the food crisis is a big thing. But we also can't forget that we're still dealing with the effects that COVID-19 brought and how a lot of people lost their livelihoods or their income and access to food. So we already had a new caseload of people in need that WFP didn't have. And now you add this, so you're just compounding need on top of need. Right. So I think it's unfortunately a bit of a perfect storm. And the reality is the funding constraint is very real. And in the same way that we had a lot of our Syrian colleagues come and deploy when I did, because we thought we might need their expertise. So we had to take colleagues out of Syria, and we had to take colleagues out of Afghanistan. So even between staff, we had to say, okay, who's like the best emergency responder? But then I end up having to rob Paul to pay Peter in contexts that are already very fragile. And donors are struggling with the same dilemmas. You have a donor that's on the phone and they're like, look, I'd like to help you. I'd like to give you more. But I have Haiti going on. I have Afghanistan. It used to be 1 hurricane per year. Now it's 3. So it's a big compounding effect.
Yeah, you used the exact phrase that came to my mind, which was a perfect storm, it sounds like. And in my last 2 minutes, I am going to ask the biggest question, perhaps, which is related to my last. And do you think you can draw any loose insights about humanitarian responses in the era of strategic competition, formerly referred to as great power competition, by taking a closer look at these two responses, or geopolitical competition?
You want to go first?
Not really. Do you want to go first?
No. I need to think about it.
I mean,
Sure.
what can we say? I mean, the landscape is changing globally. This is the
Yeah.
reality now, whether it's, international armed conflict or non-international armed conflict. I think Chiara mentioned a perfect storm, you mentioned climate crisis, you mentioned so many elements that are now culminating and leading to more civilians caught in the crossfire, whether it's conflict or as a direct consequence of natural disasters, whatever it is. I think with great power competition, like in Syria, we've seen that play out. We've seen, and I'm not the expert on non-state actors. Johnny Robinson is, for those who have interacted with him, but really in terms of thinking even within Syria, when you have, the government being supported by multiple perpetrators. You have Russia there, you have Iran, you have other sort of allies, and then in terms of opposition or non-state actors, you have almost 8,000 different groups. So just in terms of thinking this power struggle over a very small sort of geographic part of the Middle East, just in terms of thinking this is the reality. And I think for those who sort of saw early on the Arab Spring, this happened in Egypt, this happened in Tunisia, and sort of speculation that it may happen in Syria. So just, I think this, and obviously in Iraq as well, just sort of seeing this, these proxy wars that are emerging. And certainly I don't anticipate that it's going to be more stable. I think we're just going to continue to see relapses in fragility. One of my focuses sort of in my separate hat is the humanitarian development nexus, and peace as well, often called the triple nexus actually, is really looking at some of these contexts such as Mali or South Sudan or Niger, where you have very long-term conflict in addition to compounded effects from natural disasters. And you also have sort of stabilization or peace actors present as well. So you have this culmination of factors impacting stability in the country, but constant relapses into fragility. And I think we're going to continue to see that globally, and we really need to augment sort of humanitarian response, development response, sort of find a more coherent and cohesive way to respond to the needs of affected populations.
Yeah, I think for Ukraine it was a little more clear-cut than for Syria. There were less actors. It was quite black and white. And at one point I remember being there and thinking, you saw people coming from everywhere. You had Americans, the single individuals who had showed up to fight. And you had NGOs that I had never heard of that were international. And then you had a really big civil society, and it almost felt like it was a fight between good and evil. It was very black and white, and there was no question about it. It was one side or the other. It was, you were with or without them. And it, on one hand, I think that made things a little bit easier because it was kind of very clear cut. The hostility was even kind of very concentrated at one point, and things were dynamic, but again, kind of quite black and white. And I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know where that's going to go. But we've seen the escalation in the recent weeks. It could worsen. It could remain protracted. I don't know. But it has definitely called into question kind of how to operate in these environments and how to operate in an urban context. And everyone, I think, has sat down at the table and asked themselves, okay, are we equipped for this, to respond in this type of environment? A lot of organizations were not made once upon a time to deal with these types of environments. And yet Ukraine is yet another example where we're, having to ask ourselves that question, like, how can we be better? Are we still relevant? Are we still doing how can we do the right thing? And who do we need to bring to the table to do the right thing? Is that through the government? Is that with civil society? And I hope that we take away the lessons that have come from this. But I definitely think that there's been a lot of questions that have been raised within the international community about how to address these types of contexts going forward.
Well, I really appreciate both of you indulging my questions. It's time to turn it over to the floor, and we'll be circulating with microphones. Just feel free to raise your hand, and she'll bring it over for you.
Forgive my naivete, but how is it that the conflict in Syria is considered a single actor situation?
I think we have a lawyer in the room.
So it's still considered a non-international conflict because, broadly speaking, there are two types of conflicts. There's state on state. There's Russia fighting Ukraine. A non-international armed conflict is when you have non-state armed groups fighting either each other or a government. It's tricky because Russia became a part of the conflict, legally actually, by request of the Syrian government. So you can join that conflict, but it internationalizes it, but doesn't make it to an international conflict. And the reason any of this matters is because of what laws apply afterwards, which Geneva Conventions, how you do detainment, how you do charging. So it's very strange to think of like, how is Iran and Russia in Syria fighting, Syrian, force, or fighting against the, the resistance, and it's still a non-state armed, or a NIAC, a non-international armed conflict. But that's more or less the answer.
Well, I object.
Many people do. There's
Yeah.
been a movement to try to get rid of
Yeah.
it for decades, but it is.
And the law is so, I think, archaic in terms of now Syria sort of challenging that and trumping it on its head. Yeah.
You have to hold it. Hi, my name is Nader. I'm a senior. Thank you both so much for this very informative talk. The work you both do is very admirable. I'm truly inspired. My question is about the politicization of humanitarian responses. I know that supporting refugees is often politicized, and I just would like to hear a bit more about maybe a time when your responses were limited by state actors and how you would deal with or overcame those limitations.
Your response is always limited by state actor. You go first.
Yeah, I was going to say always. It's always limited on a daily basis. I think, the politicization of aid is one of the most frustrating elements of what we do, certainly because you have, government-controlled areas, you have non-government controlled areas. It's sort of a mishmash of all of these different actors. And as a humanitarian agency or humanitarian actors trying to navigate these very difficult fields, remaining neutral, remaining impartial, and sort of just delivering services is very difficult when you do see human rights violations, when there are perpetrators to the conflict. It's not happening by chance. It's not a natural disaster just happening. There are people who are actually violating the rights of the civilian population. I think a key example for us is something that is quite politicized is cross-border access to the population of northwest and northeast Syria. This relies on a UN Security Council resolution every single year because Syria is identified as a sovereign nation. And so thinking in terms of response from the UN agencies, from humanitarian actors to actually be able to deliver to this subset of the population that is essentially cut off from services delivered from the government of Syria simply because of where they lie and there are non-state actors present in this area. This resolution, I think, is one of the most contentious for us, and just seeing the different members of the UN Security Council, different nation states recognizing Syria as either a sovereign nation or recognizing that humanitarian needs should be prioritized regardless of sort of the political element behind this context. So I'll stop there, but good question. Thanks.
Okay, I guess not speaking purely about Ukraine, but in general towards other responses, we've definitely had contexts where we've struggled to access populations or where we've been kind of encouraged to go one way versus another by the state in question. And I think our biggest defense has been kind of our neutrality and our impartiality, and most of all the needs, right? So you can have a discussion with the state and say, okay, but there's people that really need this assistance. And once you show the data and you have an assessment and you have maybe multiple assessments or other partners kind of echoing your same concerns, you end up reaching most of the time an agreement. There's been contexts that I've been in where a specific state has said, no, we don't need your assistance because nothing is happening here. So no, thank you. And we said, okay, well, would you let us do an assessment? Rarely will somebody say no to even an assessment. And once you go with the data, you end up finding kind of a middle ground, right? Or in other cases, states that have said, you don't need to go here because there's nobody here. Like, well, we we think there might be. And they're like, no, there's nobody here. I'm like, okay, well, if there's nobody there, can I go see? And I'm not saying that's easy. I'm not saying the response is always yes. Sometimes you get to a standstill and you're like, okay, well, I guess I'll just wait it out. That rarely happens. But I think the needs and the data and the assessments end up becoming like our biggest defense, especially when it's you can go here and you cannot go here. We say, okay, can we do an assessment everywhere? And then we will go where the need is the biggest. So I will not go here versus there based on what you tell me or what anyone tells me. I will go to those that need it the most. And that, I think, ends up being like our biggest advocate.
Can I add one point?
Sure.
That she just
Absolutely.
like made me think of, just in terms of, I think this is really important also just in terms of like the needs guiding the services and what is essential to deliver, because I think with a lot of these contexts, you do see some form of demographic reengineering. I know in Syria, we've seen this as well, even with other allies to the government of Syria, where you have whole populations from Russia or Iran that now live in Syria, and sort of using that as a driving force, where these individuals also need some form of humanitarian aid or development. And this is sort of, this has been used not only by Syria, but also neighbors in terms of which populations are deserving of aid. And oftentimes as a humanitarian, to gain and maintain access, there are certain concessions that need to be made. So for us, we have faced a lot of ethical dilemmas. I won't lay them out here because I do need to go back to Turkey and be let into the country. But just in terms of thinking about sort of the ethics around where do you draw the line, where is it actually interference with your humanitarian response?
Hi, thank you for being here. So, like, to add to the resources thing, with limited resources and compounding crises across the globe, how do you decide where to allocate resources, or like where to pull resources from, when to pull resources from one place to assist another place? Like, what does that process look like for you?
Okay, I'll take it. Okay, so it's not pretty, is the bottom line. It's quite tragic discussions. You can be sitting in a country office and overhear your colleague saying, okay, where do we take 40,000 people off of our caseload? Because we're suddenly facing a budget cut. So behind those 40,000 people, there's 40,000 individuals. They're not just numbers. It's always very difficult discussions, but ultimately, the decision for us comes from the top. It comes from our funding. So if the money that we get for an operation is smaller this year versus last year, that is ultimately the donor's decision. WFP is voluntarily funded, so it's our member states and it's the governments that decide what to give us, how much, and where. And this is something that people don't understand, to what level of granularity they can dictate where. We could have a donor call and say, okay, tomorrow you're going to get these funds, and it's going to be for Malawi, and it's specifically going to be for your school feeding project in Malawi. It can be very, very detailed. And as a humanitarian organization, you don't get to say, well, but I'd like to allocate it to something else in Malawi. No, let alone say, I'd like to allocate it to Ukraine. So you take what you are given and you are grateful for it. But that will ultimately, whether you like it or not, dictate your response. Maybe you want to do something else in Malawi, but that is what you will end up doing because the donors get a say, right? It's their money, that's fair. Sometimes we get what we call flexible funding from certain donors who give it kind of to WFP centrally, and they're like, here are these funds for this year. We don't have too many restrictions with what you do with it, but it's very small pockets of funds. So the majority of what we get is already what we call earmarked. It's already specifically allocated to a certain operation for a specific thing. Where we make the decision is if we suddenly get less money the next year because we fundraise every year for a certain operation, and then that's when we have to cut potentially, which happens, and we will do that again based on need. So we will try to serve those most vulnerable. Those are not in such a bad condition, then we will essentially go by, there's layers, because we will have different types of food insecurity. So you have different types of what we call IPC phases. So we will essentially decide based on vulnerability, and we will cut from those most vulnerable last, if that makes sense. But that's the only moment when we kind of get a say, and it's really based on the assessments that we have. We don't make the wider decisions.
No, I think since Chiara covered the curse of earmarked funding really well, I'm going to focus on resources in terms of human resources, honestly, because for us, with long-term protracted crisis, over 70% of the medical professional population in Syria has left the country. So you have only 30% left. So just in terms of thinking, even the ability to respond from a human resource perspective effectively, where you have essentially brain drain, you have so many people who are well trained to deliver these services left the country. And then just in terms of what we call task shifting, where you no longer have physicians, you might have nurses actually doing the job of surgeons. You might have midwives now that help deliver children, just in the absence of obstetricians and gynecologists, OBGYNs. For us also, just in terms of efficiency, is with such limited human resources, is just thinking in terms of that difficult decision that Chiara's talking about, is who actually gets the aid. And oftentimes what drives it for us and many other humanitarian actors is looking at a vulnerability index. That means that, there are different grades of who's most vulnerable. Oftentimes on these indices, you'll see, female-headed households, widows, unaccompanied minors, orphans. And when you have a population where the vast majority has been affected and most are vulnerable, how do you distinguish between who is deserving of that aid or that intervention? And for us, I think particular sectors are quite neglected as well, just in terms of this balance of resources. Education is one of them. I think with Syria, when you look at sort of education being this cross between sort of humanitarian versus development, less investment means an education vacuum. And when you have an education vacuum for such a large swath of the population, that is when you have children that have been out of school for 10 years or 20 years. You do have violent extremism in some cases. As I mentioned before, you have you have child recruitment for children that need to provide for their homes and are recruited by different actors. And then just in terms of thinking of the dire vulnerability of persons with disabilities, oftentimes these programs do not incorporate very tailored responses for this vulnerable population in Syria. In Syria, there's a 30% rate of people who live with disabilities now as a direct result of the crisis, relative to the global average of around 15%. So that's almost double, just in terms of thinking, how do you actually tailor that response? And then just lastly, I just wanted to emphasize this, because oftentimes it just falls by the wayside, is mental health for people that have endured, years and years of conflict. Is oftentimes there's such a focus on physical ailments that mental health just falls by the wayside. And just we know the negative consequences, how it unravels over years of living with these mental health conditions. And just as an example, in terms of the shortage of resources in northwest Syria, a population that's about 4 million people has one psychiatrist serving them. And that's where we have had to do task shifting and training other physicians and nurses to incorporate a program called the Mental Health Gap Action Program that we've delivered with the WHO in the absence of psychiatrists, because you have the civilian population and aid workers themselves suffering from burnout and enduring the same consequences as people affected by the conflict. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, get the last question here. So the humanitarian community has often been accused of being reactive as opposed to proactive, and not having a sufficient level of advanced planning, even for crises that are predictable. And we say, like, the Ukraine crisis was acute onset and unpredictable, but really it's actually been going on since 2014, when Russia began supporting separatist movements and invaded Crimea. And even for the month before February, the US government had said that the Russian government was about to invade. They had satellite data showing the troops amassing on the border, and yet it doesn't seem like the humanitarian community began pre-positioning things. We know that, the US government says by 2020, sometime between 2025 and 2028, China's going to invade Taiwan, which will cause a massive humanitarian emergency, and we have like 5 years to prepare for it. So in what ways can the humanitarian community, do you think, actually start planning in advance for crises we know that are going to happen, and what ways are they limited and prevented from doing that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't know if I have all of the answers, but I'll try. I think there's been a lot of efforts in the international community, and specifically a lot of push from the donor community to invest in preparedness to avoid getting to the response side of things. And I think that's something that we tried to do in Ukraine. So WFP was in Ukraine in 2014. We were there briefly and at one point phased out because there was no need for WFP to stay there in the long run. And then we returned to Ukraine. We've done several missions to Ukraine, I think in the previous year, as we saw things bubbling just to monitor and keep an eye. And we had a team of colleagues who were in Kiev the 24th of February and who got stuck, like the rest of the UN community and humanitarian community, and who had to be evacuated before we could all come back in. So preparedness, I think, was definitely kind of on everyone's mind. But I think whereas you can kind of prepare more for things like hurricane season or for kind of a slow onset of things, the thing with Ukraine that was kind of shocking to me and a lot of other colleagues is that no matter who you spoke to in the embassy and locals and stuff, everybody kind of knew that it was coming, but nobody believed it would. And this applied to embassies as well. They were like, we just didn't, like, we could feel it, but we didn't think it would get to this situation. And I think all you can do in those moments, which is usually what we tend to do, is kind of prepare for the worst. So make sure that you have a sort of infrastructure, and you have the connections, you have the partners, you have the phone numbers, and you don't spend the first 72 hours, the first 2 weeks trying to call people and figure out who is who and who can do what. So I think the networking and the kind of capacity building and the partnerships have to be established before something happens. Once you start seeing like the first signs. And I think a lot of the communities working on those bases and in other countries as well, or maybe where you think things have de-escalated, but you might still need to have some things in place. And I think for us, this response in particular, but we've had others, we had to just remain very agile in the response. And I think that's the key to these contexts. You have to keep a certain degree of flexibility because, you know, at one point we had 300 staff deployed, and the questions were, okay, do we take people away? It seems like, okay, should we change it? And should we have 6 offices in Ukraine, or should we have only 2? And you have to find a balance that works for you and as an organization, that works for donors, because then what you will ask for is substantially different if you keep a heavy footprint versus a light footprint. And that's difficult to work with. So I think it's more kind of monitoring and investing in the partnerships and the capacity before something happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the core issues is that humanitarians are often told to stay in their lane, just don't address political solutions, don't address underlying root causes, just address sort of the symptoms of issues. And I think just as the world, this is really dismal, but just as the world becomes less stable in many contexts, you know, there's a deterioration of democracies, there are oppressive regimes, just all of these different elements in terms of natural disaster. A lot of these are early warning signs for what is coming, as you said, oftentimes, you know, it's not unexpected. But for me, I think maybe 2 or 3, which is one, sort of breaking these silos between humanitarian actors actually and sort of the human rights realm and sort of the political realm. And for me, there are certain parameters that I can operate in as a humanitarian, but that doesn't mean I can't coordinate, I can't collaborate with others where, for example, in Syria, there are human rights violations. So for us, we do a lot of work on the accountability piece with others that do look at this. The other element is really just understanding these deep-rooted underlying issues and working, you know, that's where diplomacy comes in. That's where, even with the Security Council, there's a political arm and there's a humanitarian arm, because oftentimes you can't unmarry the two. And for us, I think that's been the really difficult part. There's a finite, amount of resources in the world. For us, pouring money into contexts like Syria or Yemen now for 20 years or Afghanistan for 20 plus years, it will run out eventually. And without, with turning a blind eye on some of these underlying deep-rooted issues is going to lead only to more, harmful consequences. And then just in terms of really is just, breaking some of these shackles, I will say, is just, really trying to, marry all of these different elements. Like I said, because I think especially for the new wave of humanitarians or human rights actors, and certainly the appreciation for even the Center at Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies is really recognizing that, humanitarian principles do not have to be compromised by incorporating a human rights lens and an equity lens and a social justice lens to so many of these contexts. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you so much to both of you. This has been a very interesting and educational talk. I'd like to now invite everyone to join us for a reception in the lobby, and I am sure that both of our panelists would be happy to answer any questions you might still have lingering. And thank you again for coming.